I kept a secret from my new wife for 3 weeks after our wedding. Looking back now, I think some part of me always knew why. I just didn't want to admit it. My name is Walter, and I'm 63 years old. I live in Savannah, Georgia, and I have for most of my life. I was born here, raised here, buried my parents here, and buried my wife here. My first wife, Gloria, who passed away 4 years ago after 31 years of marriage. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I didn't even have time to figure out how to be scared before she was gone. After she passed, I didn't think about dating. I didn't think about much of anything for a long time, honestly. I kept the landscaping business running, the one Gloria and I built together from nothing, starting with one truck and a second-hand mower back in 1995. By the time she died, we had 12 full-time employees, 3 commercial contracts with the city, and more residential clients than I could keep straight without a spreadsheet. I just kept going to work because work was the only thing that made sense. My daughter Renee worried about me. She'd call every other day, drive down from Colombia on weekends, sometimes just to make sure I was eating. She's a good woman, my daughter. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's way of reading a room. I wasn't looking for anyone when I met Diane. It was at a fundraiser for the Boys and Girls Club down on Bay Street. One of those dinner events where you pay $200 a plate and they serve you chicken that tastes like it was cooked 3 hours before you arrived. I went because one of my commercial clients asked me to buy a table, and I didn't have a good reason to say no. I was standing near the back, holding a glass of sweet tea. I wasn't really drinking when this woman next to me said, "I think the chicken's giving me a look." I laughed, a real laugh, not the polite kind. And that was how it started. Diane was 57 at the time. She had moved to Savannah from Columbus, Ohio, about a year before, following her younger sister, she said, who had married a man down here. She was recently divorced after a 20-year marriage. No children. She worked as an office manager for a dental practice over on Abercorn. She was funny and warm, and she had this way of leaning in when she listened to you, like what you were saying was the only thing in the world that mattered. I noticed that right away. We exchanged numbers that night. We had coffee the following week, then dinner, then more dinners. She met Renee about 2 months in. That did not go as well as I'd hoped. Renee was polite, the way she gets when she's being careful. On the drive home afterward, she said, "Dad, I just want you to take your time. That was all. But I know my daughter, that was not all. I want to explain the secret because it matters to understanding everything that came after. I never told Diane exactly what I owned. I told her I ran a landscaping company. That part was true. But I didn't mention that we also owned the building the company operated out of, a commercial property on the west side that Gloria and I bought in 2008 when prices were low. I didn't mention the 2 rental houses we picked up over the years. Both of them paid off. I didn't mention that the landscaping business itself was worth considerably more than what it looked like from the outside, and that I had been approached twice in the last 2 years by a regional company looking to acquire it. I just said I ran a landscaping business, and I let her assume what she was going to assume. Why? Honestly, because of something a man at my church said to me about 8 months after Gloria passed. He was a deacon, a man who'd lost his own wife and remarried within a couple years. He pulled me aside one Sunday and said, "Walter, when you're ready to look again, don't show your whole hand at the table before you know who you're playing with." I thought it was a little cynical at the time, but it stayed with me. I wasn't trying to trap Diane. I want to be clear about that. I was just being careful the way a man learns to be careful. When you spent a lifetime building something worth protecting, when you worked 30 years for what you have, when your wife worked alongside you for 30 of those years, missing vacations and driving a 12-year-old car so you could reinvest in the business, you don't just hand that story over to a stranger at a fundraiser dinner. We dated for about 8 months before she brought up marriage. She brought it up. I want to be honest about the order of things. We were sitting on my back porch one evening in late spring, the fireflies just starting to come out, and she said, "Do you ever think about where this is going?" And I said yes. And she said, "I'd like to know I'm not wasting time." She was 58 by then. I understood what she meant. I didn't hold it against her. I should have slowed down. I know that now. Renee told me to slow down. She said it plainly, not unkindly, sitting at my kitchen table the week I told her I was thinking about proposing. She said, "Daddy, 8 months is not very long. You don't really know her." I said I knew enough. She looked at me the way her mother used to look at me when I was being stubborn, and she said, "Okay." One word. That was Renee being gracious when she thought I was making a mistake. We got married in October. Small ceremony. Just family and close friends at the Botanical Garden. It was a nice day. Cool and clear. The kind of Savannah fall day you wait all summer for. I remember standing there thinking about Gloria for a moment. Just a flicker, and then letting it pass. Diane looked happy. I was hopeful. We had not discussed, in any real detail, where we were going to live after the wedding. I realize how that sounds, but here's what had been said. Diane was renting an apartment on the south side. I owned my home, a 4-bedroom house in Ardsley Park that Gloria and I had lived in for 19 years. It seemed obvious to me that she would move into my house. We had talked in general terms about making it her home too, about her putting her things there, making changes if she wanted. I thought we were on the same page. The morning after the wedding, we were having coffee in the kitchen. We had decided not to do a honeymoon right away, which in hindsight was probably another sign I missed. And Diane looked around the kitchen and said, "I was thinking we should probably talk about the house situation." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, this house is very you and Gloria. And I think for us to really start fresh, we should think about selling it and finding something that belongs to both of us." I set my coffee cup down. I said slowly, "You want to sell this house." She said, "I think it would be good for both of us to have a clean start. And honestly, the money from this house would let us get something really nice, maybe something closer to the water." She said it like we'd already talked about it, like it was a natural next step that I'd simply forgotten we'd agreed to. I didn't say much. I said I needed to think about it. She nodded and smiled and said, of course, there was no rush. But something had shifted in me in that moment, quietly, like a door closing in a room down the hall. That was day 2 of our marriage. By the end of the first week, there were more conversations like that first one. Small ones, probing ones. She mentioned that her sister's husband, a man I had met once, was a financial advisor and had some good investment opportunities he'd been wanting to share with me. She asked how the business was doing, more specifically than she ever had before. She asked whether my rental properties were professionally managed or whether I handled them myself. She was casual about it. But the questions were not casual. I still said nothing about the full picture. I just answered simply and briefly and watched. Her son called her during the second week. I had known she had a son. She had told me early on that she had no children, and I had not pressed it. On a Thursday evening, she was on the phone in the bedroom, and I could hear her end of the conversation. When she came out, she said, almost too casually, "That was my son, Marcus. He's 22. He's been living in Atlanta, but things haven't been working out. Job situation, and he might need to come stay with us for a little while." I was very still for a moment. I said, "You have a son," she said. "I should have mentioned him sooner. We've had a complicated relationship. I didn't want to bring extra baggage into things before we got serious." I said, "We got married, Diane." She said, "I know. And now we're serious, so I'm telling you." She smiled when she said it. Like that was the right answer. I thought about Renee. I thought about what she would say if I called her right then. I didn't call her. Marcus arrived the following Saturday with 3 bags and a flat-screen television he'd wrapped in a moving blanket. He was tall and good-looking, and he greeted me with a handshake and "Hey, Walter." Not sir, not Mr. Caldwell, just Walter. and a look in his eyes that told me he had already been told certain things about this house, this situation, and what it might mean for him. He set his television up in the guest room like he'd already decided he was staying. Diane made dinner that night, and the three of us sat at the table together, and she talked about how nice it was going to be, all of us under one roof, a real family. Marcus ate quietly and scrolled his phone under the table when he thought I wasn't looking. That night, after Diane fell asleep, I sat in the living room in the dark for a while. The house was quiet. I looked at the bookshelf where Gloria's photo still sat. I hadn't taken it down, and Diane hadn't asked me to, not yet, and I thought about what was happening. I thought about the house in Ardsley Park that Diane wanted to sell. I thought about the rental properties she'd been asking about. I thought about her sister's husband, the financial advisor with the investment opportunities. I thought about Marcus and his flat-screen television in my guest room, and I thought about what the deacon told me. Don't show your whole hand until you know who you're playing with. The next morning I called my attorney. Her name is Patricia, and she has handled my business and personal legal affairs for 11 years. I trust her completely. I explained what had happened and asked her to review everything. The deed on the house, the business documents, the rental property titles, and make sure nothing was exposed that I hadn't intended to expose. She called me back the following afternoon and said, "Walter, you're fine, everything's clean, but I want to ask you something." She paused and then said, "Did this woman sign a prenuptial agreement?" I said no. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Then you need to come see me." I went to see Patricia on a Wednesday. We were married on a Saturday in October, and it was now early November. 3 weeks in. Patricia laid it all out for me. In the state of Georgia, marital assets, meaning assets acquired or mingled during a marriage, can be subject to division in a divorce. The house itself, because it was acquired before the marriage and remained in my name only, was likely protected as separate property, but it depended on many factors. The business was more complicated. If I had used any marital funds, commingled income, added her to anything, it could get murky. She told me I needed to document everything. She told me to be very careful about what I agreed to in the coming weeks. I drove home and I sat in the driveway for a long time. I want to say something here that I've thought about a great deal since this all happened. I am not a suspicious man by nature. I am not the kind of person who assumes the worst. In 31 years of marriage to Gloria, I never once had reason to doubt her. And I think that's partly why I was not prepared for what was happening to me. When you have only ever known one kind of person, you can mistake a different kind for being the same. That evening, Diane brought up the house again. She had apparently been doing some research. She told me that a house similar to ours in Ardsley Park had just sold for $420,000, and that if we sold and combined that equity with what she described as our other assets, we could get something on the water in Isle of Hope, or maybe Wilmington Island. She said, "Our other assets," the way you'd say something you've been practicing. I said, "Diane, I want to talk to you about something." She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, attentive, alert. I said, "I haven't been fully transparent with you about my financial situation, and I think it's time I was." She sat forward a little. I said, "The landscaping business isn't just a landscaping business. I own it outright. The company, the equipment, the building it operates out of. I've had acquisition offers. The last one was for just under $2 million, and I turned it down. I also own 2 rental properties, both paid off, and this house which is in my name alone and has been since 2004. I'm telling you this because I think you deserve to know, and because I think you've been making certain assumptions and plans based on incomplete information." She was very quiet. I said, "I also want to ask you directly about Marcus. When were you planning to tell me about him, and what did you tell him about me?" The quiet stretched out a little longer than I expected. Then she said, "I don't appreciate the implication." I said, "I'm not implying anything. I'm asking directly." What followed was not a conversation I want to relive in detail. But I will say this. The version of Diane I had seen at the Boys and Girls Club dinner, the warm woman who joked about the chicken and leaned in when she listened, she was not the woman sitting across from me that evening. The woman across from me was cool and calculating, and chose her words carefully. She talked about what she had contributed to the relationship, her time, her emotional energy, relocating her life. She talked about what she felt she was owed as my wife. She used the word entitled more than once. She did not answer my question about Marcus. I called Renee the next morning. She drove down from Colombia that same day. She sat with me in the kitchen, listening, and when I finished telling her everything, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, I'm glad you didn't sell the house." And then she said, "I'm glad you called Patricia when you did." That was all. "No, I told you so." That's not Renee. The following 2 weeks were not easy. Diane and I were civil but distant. Marcus stayed in his room mostly, sensing, I suppose, that something had shifted. I called Patricia twice more. Diane had a consultation with her own attorney, I found out later. At one point she told me that she felt deceived because I had not disclosed my assets before we married, which struck me as remarkable, given what I now knew about Marcus and about the conversations she'd apparently been having with her sister's husband about opportunities related to my business even before we were married. Patricia had a phrase for what was happening. She called it a clarity event, when the smoke clears and everybody knows what everybody is actually dealing with. The marriage was over within 6 weeks of the wedding. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no moment where anyone threw anything across a room. There was a conversation, then several conversations, then attorneys, then paperwork. Diane and Marcus moved out on a Saturday in December, which in Savannah was cold enough that you could see your breath. I stood in the doorway and watched them load the car. She had arrived with love and a plan. She left with the things she'd brought and not a single thing more. I want to be honest about what I felt. I was sad. Not the devastating grief sadness of losing Gloria. Nothing will ever be that, but a quieter sadness. The sadness of having hoped for something and been wrong. I don't think I felt foolish exactly, because I had listened to the right voice eventually. But I had not listened to it soon enough, and I had not listened to my daughter. And that cost me 6 weeks and a great deal of legal fees and more than a few sleepless nights. I also felt something else underneath the sadness. Something like relief so deep, it felt like setting down a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. Patricia finalized everything by February. Because the marriage was so short and no assets had been commingled, and because Georgia law treats separately held premarital property fairly clearly when it hasn't been touched, I was protected. The house stayed. The business stayed. The rental properties stayed. Everything Gloria and I had built together, every early morning, every reinvested profit, every year of steady work, it all stayed where it belonged. I took Renee to dinner at a place she loves down on River Street when it was all done. She ordered the shrimp and grits, and we talked about other things for most of the meal. And then, at the end, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand and said, "Mom would be proud of you." I didn't say anything. I just nodded, because if I'd opened my mouth I was going to cry in the middle of a restaurant, and I'm 63 years old and I have some dignity to maintain. I'm not writing this down because I want sympathy. I don't. I made choices that a wiser or more patient man might not have made, and I own that. I got swept up in something that felt real and moved too fast and didn't ask the right questions early enough. The deacon was right, but I should have listened harder and longer before I ever got to the altar. I'm telling this story because I know I'm not the only one. I know there are men and women my age, widowed, divorced, lonely in the way that only people who had a good marriage and lost it can be lonely, who are out there navigating this exact terrain. And I know how easy it is to want to believe someone, to want, badly enough, that you stop asking whether you should. Trust your instincts. Trust the people who love you and have nothing to gain. Take your time And before you let anyone close to what you spent a lifetime building, make sure you know not just who they say they are, but what they do when they think they already have what they want. The fireflies came back this past spring, same as always. I sat on the back porch by myself the first night I saw them, and I thought about that evening with Diane, when she said she wanted to know where things were going. I thought about how hopeful I felt, and I let myself feel that too, not as a wound, but as evidence that I'm still capable of hoping. That part of me is still there. I'm just going to be more careful with it now. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. Not to beat myself up over it, I'm past that, but to actually understand it. Because I think if you don't take the time to understand something like this, it'll just happen to you again in a different form, wearing a different face. Here's what I keep coming back to. Nothing that Diane did was accidental. That's the part that took me the longest to accept. The questions about the rental properties, the mention of her sister's husband and his investment opportunities, Marcus showing up with his television and his first-name attitude, none of it was random. It was a sequence. And sequences like that don't come from nowhere. They come from planning, which means, on some level, I was chosen. Not because she loved me, because I seemed like someone who could be moved, and the reason she thought I could be moved is because I was lonely, and lonely people in their 60s can sometimes look to the wrong kind of person, like an open door. That's not self-pity. That's just honesty. And I'd rather be honest about it than pretend I was some innocent man who got blindsided by lightning. I made choices. I moved fast when I should have slowed down. I didn't listen to Renee when she sat at my kitchen table and told me 8 months wasn't very long. She was right, and I knew it somewhere, and I proposed anyway, because I wanted to be done with being alone. That wanting, that's where it started. Not with Diane. With me. What I understand now, on the other side of it, is that desire without discernment is just vulnerability, walking around with its eyes closed. You can want a good life. You can want companionship and warmth and someone to share the back porch with in the evenings. All of that is legitimate. All of that is human. But wanting something doesn't give you the right to skip the part where you actually find out who you're dealing with. Renee knew. Not because she's suspicious by nature, but because she was paying attention without needing anything from the situation. That's what loving someone without an agenda looks like. It looks like clear eyes. I had blurry ones because I was looking through the filter of what I hoped was true. The thing about cause and effect is that it doesn't wait for you to be ready. Every choice lands somewhere. My choice to move fast landed me in a 6-week marriage and a stack of legal fees. My choice to listen to the deacon's advice, to not show my whole hand, landed me with everything I'd built still intact. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I have to hold both of them. Gloria and I spent 31 years building something together. Not just the business, not just the properties, but a life with real weight to it. What I owe that life, what I owe her memory, is to be smarter than I was last October. To value what we built enough to protect it, to not hand it over to the first person who smiled at me in the right way at the right moment. I'm not closed off. I want to be clear about that. I still sat on the back porch and watched the fireflies come back this spring and felt grateful to be here. That capacity to still find something worth being grateful for. That's the thing I'm most interested in protecting now. Not the houses, not the business. That. Take your time. Know what you're protecting and why. And trust the people who love you enough to tell you the truth when you don't want to hear it.